The morning sun hadn't yet risen over the quiet Atlanta suburb of Pine Hills when Robert Johnson's alarm buzzed at 5:15 a.m. It was a Thursday like any other, and the 45-year-old software engineer followed his usual routine: shower, dress in his comfortable work-from-home clothes, and head downstairs to brew his morning coffee. The neighborhood was still sleeping, wrapped in that peaceful silence that comes just before dawn. Through his kitchen window, Robert could see the golden streetlights still glowing against the deep blue sky. He loved these quiet moments, just him and his thoughts, before the world fully woke up. As his coffee maker hummed to life, Robert glanced around his living room. Shelves lined every wall, each one carefully crafted and installed by his own hands over weekends and evenings. To others, it might have looked cluttered, but to him, each shelf told a story. They held more than just books. They held history, dreams, and memories. What most people didn't know about Pine Hills was that it had changed dramatically over the past few months. The once peaceful suburb had been rattled by a series of break-ins. First, it was the Thompson house 3 streets over. Then the local convenience store. Last week, Mrs. Chen's place had been hit while she was visiting her daughter in California. The community was on edge, and people were starting to look at their neighbors differently. Robert had noticed the changes in small ways. The casual waves between neighbors became shorter, more hesitant. Parents called their children in earlier at dusk. More security cameras appeared on porches, their little red lights blinking like artificial stars in the night. Even Mr. Wilson, who'd lived next door for 20 years, had started giving Robert odd looks when he received his regular evening visitors. What the neighbors saw was suspicious. Different cars pulling up to Robert's house at odd hours, people carrying boxes in and out, hushed conversations on the front porch. What they didn't know was that each visitor was a researcher, a historian, or a student working on their thesis. Each box contained pieces of history that Robert had spent years tracking down and acquiring. As Robert settled into his favorite chair at the dining room table, coffee mug warming his hands, he opened his laptop to check his email. There was a message from a professor at Howard University about visiting next week to examine some rare documents. Another from an auction house about an upcoming sale of 19th century manuscripts. This was his other life, the one his neighbors knew nothing about. The sky outside was beginning to lighten, changing from deep blue to a softer shade of morning. Robert could hear the first birds starting their morning songs, and somewhere down the street, a car engine rumbled to life as an early commuter headed to work. He took a sip of his coffee, savoring the rich Colombian blend he discovered at a local shop. His phone buzzed with a text from his sister. "Did you see the neighborhood watch alert? Another break-in on Oak Street. Stay safe, big bro." Robert sighed, picking up his phone to respond. The break-ins were getting closer to his street, and he couldn't help but worry about his collection. Each piece was irreplaceable, not just in monetary value but in historical significance. What Robert didn't know was that at that very moment, just a few blocks away, police officers were gathering in the pre-dawn darkness. An anonymous tip had come in the night before, describing suspicious activity at his address. The caller had mentioned frequent visitors, strange hours, and packages being moved in and out of the house. In the context of the recent break-ins, it was enough to raise serious concerns. Detective Lisa Chen reviewed the search warrant one last time in her patrol car. The description matched what they were looking for: potential stolen goods being moved through a residential property. The pattern fit, and with the neighborhood on high alert, they couldn't afford to ignore the tip. She'd been working the break-in cases for months, and this could be the break they needed. The tactical team was already in position, their vehicles parked quietly around the corner. They'd chosen 6:00 a.m. for the raid. Early enough to catch any suspects off guard, but late enough that they wouldn't disturb the entire neighborhood. Officer James Parker checked his vest one last time, thinking about the briefing they'd received. The suspect was described as a middle-aged man living alone, no prior record, but the recent pattern of criminal activity in the area had everyone on edge. Back in his dining room, Robert was completely unaware of what was about to unfold. He was lost in thought, planning his day ahead. There was a video call with his development team at 9:00 a.m., then he needed to catalog some recent acquisitions. A graduate student was coming by in the afternoon to research early civil rights pamphlets for their dissertation. The morning light was growing stronger now, filtering through the trees and casting long shadows across his front yard. Robert stood up to refill his coffee cup, his bare feet quiet on the hardwood floors. The house creaked softly, familiar sounds that he'd grown used to over the years. Each board, each corner of this home held memories and purpose. As he walked back to the dining room, coffee cup full again, Robert paused to straighten a frame on the wall. A black and white photograph of his grandfather standing proudly in his World War II uniform. It was one of his most treasured possessions, not valuable to anyone else, but priceless to him. His grandfather had been the one who first taught him the importance of preserving history, of keeping stories alive. The clock on his mantel showed 5:55 a.m. In just 5 minutes, Robert's quiet morning routine would be shattered in a way he never could have imagined. But for now, he sat peacefully at his dining room table, unaware that his life was about to change forever. He took another sip of his coffee, enjoying the warmth and silence of the early morning, while outside, police officers moved quietly into position around his house. The birds had stopped singing. The first sound was like thunder, a deep boom that shook the windows and rattled the coffee cup on Robert's dining room table. For a split second, he thought it was a storm, until he heard the splintering of wood and the shouting began. His front door burst open with such force that a nearby picture frame crashed to the floor, glass shattering across the hardwood. "Police, don't move. Hands where we can see them." The commands echoed through his house, bouncing off walls lined with bookshelves. Robert sat frozen, his hands gripping his coffee cup, his mind struggling to process what was happening. Flashlight beams cut through the dim morning light, dancing across his walls like searching spotlights. Heavy boots thundered through his home, the sound growing louder as officers moved room to room. Robert could hear doors being thrown open upstairs, drawers sliding, closets being searched. Each noise made him flinch, but he remained seated, his heart pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Detective Chen was the first to enter the dining room, her weapon drawn, flashlight beam momentarily blinding Robert. Behind her, 4 more officers spread out, their movements precise and practiced. They'd expected resistance, maybe a scramble to hide evidence or destroy documents. Instead, they found a middle-aged man in a faded blue sweater sitting calmly at his dining room table. "Sir, put your hands on the table where we can see them," Detective Chen commanded, her voice firm but controlled. Robert slowly placed his palms flat on the wooden surface, the coffee cup still steaming beside them. His fingers trembled slightly, but his voice remained steady when he spoke. "I'm not armed," he said quietly. "I'm just having my morning coffee." The officers moved through the room with practiced efficiency, checking corners and doorways. But something was off. Instead of finding stashed stolen goods or signs of criminal activity, they were surrounded by books. Hundreds of books, thousands of them. Each wall was covered floor to ceiling with carefully organized shelves. Officer Parker lowered his weapon first, his eyes drawn to the nearest bookshelf. These weren't ordinary books. They were old, their leather bindings worn with age, their pages yellowed by time. His flashlight beam caught gilt lettering on one spine, the date clearly visible, 1847. The tension in the room began to shift. Detective Chen's trained eye moved from the suspect to her surroundings, taking in details that didn't match their intelligence. The house was immaculate, every book carefully labeled and catalogued. This wasn't the chaos of a fencer's hideout or a burglar's stash. Robert remained still, watching as confusion slowly replaced suspicion on the officers' faces. Morning light was streaming through the windows now, illuminating dust particles disturbed by the sudden intrusion. In that golden light, his collection seemed to come alive, each book telling its own story of preservation and care. "Sir," Detective Chen said, her tone noticeably softer, "we have a warrant to search these premises." She pulled the document from her vest pocket, placing it on the table near Robert's hands. "We've received reports of suspicious activity and possible connections to recent break-ins in the area." Robert nodded slowly, his eyes moving from the warrant to the officers still searching his home. Upstairs, he could hear more exclamations of surprise as they discovered his study, with its temperature-controlled storage and specialized archival equipment. "I'm a software engineer," he explained, his voice growing steadier. but I'm also a collector and preservationist of historical documents, particularly rare books and manuscripts. Those suspicious activities your witnesses reported, those were historians and researchers coming to study the collection. Detective Chen glanced at a nearby shelf where a framed certificate hung between the books. It was from a prestigious university, thanking Robert for his contributions to their historical research department. Next to it was a photograph of him speaking at a library conference. The sound of boots on stairs announced the return of the officers who'd searched the second floor. They looked almost apologetic as they rejoined their colleagues. One of them, a younger officer named Thompson, couldn't contain his amazement. "Ma'am, you need to see what's upstairs," he said to Detective Chen. "It's like a museum up there. Climate control systems, proper archival storage, everything's documented and catalogued. There's even a restoration workshop." The morning sun had fully risen now, streaming through the windows and highlighting the brass handles on Robert's antique card catalog cabinet. The room smelled of old leather, paper, and the coffee that was now growing cold on the table. The aggressive energy of the raid had completely dissipated, replaced by a mixture of embarrassment and genuine curiosity. Robert watched as Officer Parker was drawn to a particular volume on a nearby shelf. The officer's fingers hovered near the spine but didn't touch it, showing an instinctive respect for its age and value. "That's a first edition," Robert offered, his voice warming as he spoke about his passion. "Published in 1856, it survived a fire that destroyed most of the other copies. Took me 3 years to track it down." Detective Chen holstered her weapon, gesturing for the other officers to do the same. The room felt different now, no longer a crime scene, but a place of learning and preservation. She pulled out a chair across from Robert, the sound of wood scraping against wood unusually loud in the quiet room. "Mr. Johnson," she said, "I think we need to start over. Would you mind telling us about your collection?" Robert glanced at his cold coffee cup, then back at the detective. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Would anyone like a fresh cup of coffee? This might take a while." Outside, the neighborhood was waking up, curtains twitching as curious neighbors tried to understand why police vehicles lined their quiet street. What they couldn't see was how a raid intended to uncover stolen goods had instead uncovered something far more valuable. A hidden treasure trove of history, carefully preserved and protected by the quiet man they'd barely noticed living among them. The fresh pot of coffee filled the room with its rich aroma as Robert led Detective Chen and Officer Parker through his collection. The morning sun now streamed fully through the windows, illuminating decades of carefully preserved history. The other officers had been dispatched to continue their neighborhood patrol, leaving behind their initial suspicions and taking with them a story they could hardly believe. "It started with one book," Robert explained, carefully lifting a worn volume from a nearby shelf. "My grandfather's copy of poems from the 1920s. He used to read it to me when I was young, telling me about how his father had saved up for months to buy it." His fingers traced the delicate spine with familiar care. "After he passed, I realized how many stories like this were out there, just waiting to be preserved." Detective Chen cradled her coffee cup, her trained investigator's eye taking in details she'd missed during the raid. Each shelf had its own climate control monitor, tiny digital displays showing temperature and humidity levels. The books weren't just arranged alphabetically. They were organized by historical period, significance, and condition. "These look like they belong in a museum," Officer Parker remarked, peering at a glass-enclosed case containing what appeared to be original pamphlets from the 1800s. The paper was yellowed but remarkably preserved, the text still crisp and readable after more than a century. Robert smiled, the kind of smile that comes from hearing a familiar compliment. "Actually, several museums have offered to buy pieces of the collection. But these aren't just artifacts to be displayed behind glass. They're living history, meant to be studied and understood." He led them to his cataloging station, where a high-resolution scanner and computer setup occupied a corner of the room. "Every document gets digitized," he explained, pulling up images on the monitor. "The originals are preserved, but digital copies mean researchers worldwide can access these materials without risking damage to the physical items." Detective Chen set her coffee down, drawn to a particular section of shelving where newspapers from the 1960s were carefully preserved in acid-free containers. "These are from the civil rights movement," she said softly, recognizing the headlines. "Yes," Robert nodded, moving closer. "Some of these papers were from small local presses that didn't survive. Their stories might have been lost completely if someone hadn't thought to save them." He carefully slid out one protected document. "This one's from a small town paper that only printed for 6 months, but it captured moments that the bigger papers missed." Officer Parker had wandered to another corner of the room where a restoration workbench was set up. Specialized tools and materials were organized with surgical precision. "You do the restoration work yourself?" he asked, noticing the magnifying equipment and carefully labeled conservation materials. "Some of it," Robert replied. "I trained with a professional conservator for 2 years. The simpler repairs I can handle, but anything major goes to experts. These pieces are too important to risk amateur mistakes." As they moved through the house, the full scope of the collection began to reveal itself. What had initially looked like just rooms full of books was actually a carefully curated journey through time. Each section told its own story, from early religious texts to first-edition novels, from handwritten letters to typed manuscripts bearing famous signatures. "This room maintains a constant 65 degrees, Robert explained as they entered his temperature-controlled storage area. "Humidity at 45%. It's where I keep the most delicate items." He gestured to a set of flat files. "These drawers contain original photographs from the 1800s. They're incredibly sensitive to environmental changes." Detective Chen found herself drawn to a small display case near the window. Inside was a simple notebook, its pages filled with handwritten poetry. "The date on this?" she trailed off, amazed. 1847, Robert confirmed. It belonged to a young writer who never published during his lifetime. His great-granddaughter found it in an attic and almost threw it away. Now it's being studied by literature scholars who say it might change our understanding of that entire period. Officer Parker had been quiet for a while, taking everything in. Finally, he spoke. "The neighbors who reported suspicious activity, they saw people coming and going at odd hours?" Robert nodded, understanding dawning on his face. "Researchers often work unusual schedules. Some fly in just for a day or two to study specific pieces. And yes, we're sometimes up late, excited about a new discovery or working to document something properly." He paused, a slight smile crossing his face. "I suppose from the outside, it might have looked strange." 1 month after the raid, Robert's home had transformed into something nobody could have predicted. The police department, eager to make amends for their mistaken assumptions, had become unexpected partners in protecting and promoting this historical treasure. Today, Officer Parker was leading a group of fellow officers through the house, not for investigation, but for education. "And this," Robert said, carefully lifting a protected document, "is a newspaper from 1865. Notice how the paper quality is different from what we use today. That's part of why preservation is so crucial." The officers leaned in, genuinely fascinated by the yellowed pages that still carried news from over 150 years ago. Detective Chen, who had become a regular presence in the house, stood in the doorway watching with a smile. She remembered the morning they'd burst through that door, weapons drawn, expecting to find stolen goods. Instead, they discovered something far more valuable, a window into the past that was changing their present. "The most remarkable thing happened yesterday," Robert told the group, carefully replacing the newspaper in its protective sleeve. "A local high school teacher brought her class here. One of the students recognized his great-grandfather in a photograph from 1945. The whole class spent an hour listening to him share family stories that had been passed down. We recorded everything for the archives." The house had been modified to better serve its new role. The university had helped install proper lighting and climate control throughout. The dining room where Robert had been drinking coffee during the raid was now a proper research space, with large tables and carefully controlled lighting. But he kept his favorite coffee mug, now something of a lucky charm, sitting on a special shelf. "The security system you recommended has been a game changer," Robert told Officer Parker, showing him the new monitoring equipment. "We've integrated it with the climate control sensors, so we can track both security and preservation conditions from one dashboard." Outside, a tour bus pulled up, the third one this week. The neighborhood had embraced its newfound fame, with local businesses even creating historically themed specials to attract visitors. Mrs. Chen from the Corner Cafe had renamed her daily special the Historian's Breakfast. "Remember when we thought all these visitors were suspicious?" Detective Chen laughed, watching as another group of excited history enthusiasts filed off the bus. "Now the whole neighborhood acts as unofficial security. Mrs. Thompson across the street keeps a logbook of everyone who comes and goes, not out of suspicion anymore, but pride." The police department had taken an official role in protecting the collection, incorporating regular patrols and creating a special response protocol for any security alerts from the house. But more than that, they'd become genuine supporters of its mission. Last week, Officer Parker shared with his colleagues, "My daughter's college professor mentioned this collection in their American history class. I got to raise my hand and say I was one of the officers who discovered it. Never thought I'd be part of a story that ended up in a college classroom." Robert led the group upstairs to his newest addition, a proper conservation lab funded by a historical society grant. "This is where we do the delicate work of preserving documents," he explained, showing them the specialized equipment. "That magnifying system there can spot damage that's invisible to the naked eye." The officers watched as a conservator demonstrated the painstaking process of stabilizing a fragile letter from the 1890s. The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of the climate control system and the soft brush of conservation tools. "It's like performing surgery," whispered one officer, watching as the conservator delicately repaired a torn edge. "But instead of saving a life, you're saving history." Back downstairs, a group of university students had arrived to continue their cataloging project. They worked at the large tables, carefully photographing and documenting each piece in the collection. Their excited whispers filled the air as they discovered new details in century-old documents. "The digital database is already making a difference," Robert explained to the officers. "Last month, a researcher in London found information in one of our documents that helped solve a historical mystery they'd been working on for years. All because these pieces of history are now accessible to scholars worldwide." Detective Chen had moved to look at a new display case near the window. Inside was the search warrant from the raid, carefully preserved alongside photographs of the police officers who had first entered the house that morning. "You kept it," she said, surprised. "These came from a photographer's private collection," Robert explained, carefully turning over one of the images to show the handwritten notes on the back. He was hired to document the construction progress, but he also captured the daily lives of the workers, their families, their communities. These weren't meant to be part of the official record, but they tell an incredibly important part of the story. As they examined each photograph, Robert shared the story of how it had come into his collection. Some had been found at flea markets, others rescued from dumpsters, and a few had been purchased at auctions where Robert had spent his entire savings to preserve these pieces of history. "Every single item here has a story," he said, carefully replacing the photographs in their protective folders. "Not just the story contained within them, but the story of how they survived, how they were found, and why they matter." Dr. Richardson nodded, making notes in her research journal. "You've created more than a collection," she said thoughtfully. "You've built a bridge to the past. These aren't just old books and papers, they're voices that might have been lost forever if someone hadn't cared enough to preserve them." Robert looked around at his life's work, at the shelves of carefully preserved history that had so recently been mistaken for something entirely different. "That's exactly why I do this," he said quietly. "Every piece here is a voice from the past waiting to be heard. Our job is to make sure those voices aren't forgotten." As the sun set outside, casting long shadows through the UV-protected windows, Robert and Dr. Richardson continued their careful examination of history's treasures. Each page turned, each document examined brought another story to light, another voice from the past speaking clearly across the decades. The room that had been filled with police officers just days ago was now serving its true purpose as a sanctuary for history, a place where the past was not just preserved, but understood and honored. Word spread quickly through academic circles about the remarkable discovery in the Atlanta suburbs. What had started as a misguided police raid was now being called one of the most significant finds in recent historical preservation. 1 week after the incident, Robert's quiet home had become the center of attention for historians, researchers, and preservationists from across the country. "I never expected this much interest," Robert admitted to Detective Chen, who had stopped by to check on him. They sat in his kitchen, watching through the window as a teen from a major university carefully catalogued his collection. "I was just trying to save pieces of history that seemed important." The detective smiled, stirring her tea. She'd become a regular visitor, fascinated by the stories behind each piece in the collection. "Sometimes the biggest revelations come from the smallest misunderstandings," she said, "though I still feel bad about your door." Robert laughed, a warm, genuine sound that filled the kitchen. The university offered to pay for a new one. They're also installing a proper security system. Turns out they're as worried about protecting these documents as I am. Outside, a small crowd had gathered. The neighbors who had once viewed Robert's home with suspicion were now proudly telling reporters about the historical treasure in their community. Mr. Wilson, who had lived next door for 20 years, was currently explaining to a local news crew how he'd always known there was something special about that house. "Dr. Thompson from the National Archives called this morning," Robert said, pulling out a letter from his pocket. "They want to work with me to create a digital database of everything. She says some of these documents could change the way we understand certain historical events." The detective leaned forward, intrigued. "How so?" Robert led her to his study, where a particular document lay carefully preserved on his work table. "Take this letter, for instance," he said, pointing to the yellowed paper protected behind archival-grade glass. It was written by a shopkeeper in 1863. Everyone thought their store was just a small business, but this letter reveals they were actually part of a network helping people escape to freedom. It's a completely new piece of a puzzle historians have been trying to solve for decades. As they talked, Dr. Lewis from the State Historical Society was carefully examining a collection of photographs in the next room. Her excited voice carried through the doorway. "Robert, these images from the 1890s, they show buildings we thought were destroyed much earlier. This completely changes our understanding of how the city developed." The revelation of Robert's collection had sparked something unexpected in the community. Local schools were organizing field trips to visit the house. Teachers saw it as a chance to make history come alive for their students. The university was talking about establishing a permanent research position dedicated to studying and cataloging the collection. Yesterday, a young student came by with her grandfather, Robert told Detective Chen as they walked through the house. The grandfather recognized a photograph of his old neighborhood from the 1940s. He spent 2 hours telling us stories about every person in that picture. "We recorded everything," another piece of history preserved. The detective paused by a window, watching as more cars pulled up outside. "You know, when we got that tip about suspicious activity, we thought we were going to uncover stolen goods. Instead, we uncovered something that had been stolen from all of us, our connection to the past." Robert nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly why I started collecting. These aren't just old papers and books. They're voices from the past, telling us who we were, who we are, and maybe even who we could be." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. It was Professor Richardson from the State University, clutching a folder of papers. "Robert, you need to see this," she said excitedly. "We've been cross-referencing your collection with our archives. Remember that diary from the school teacher? We found letters from 3 of her students in our university collection. They mention her by name and describe her lessons." The professor spread the papers out on the dining room table, the same table where Robert had been sitting with his coffee during the raid. "This is incredible," she continued. "It's like finding 2 pieces of a puzzle that have been separated for over a century. And there's more. One of those students went on to become a significant figure in the civil rights movement. Their earliest inspiration came from this teacher, and now we have both sides of the story." Detective Chen watched as Robert and the professor pored over the documents, their excitement palpable. She thought about the morning of the raid, how different things might have been if they'd known what was really behind those doors. As the afternoon sun filled the room, more visitors arrived. A group of graduate students eagerly set up their laptops, ready to help with the cataloging process. A documentary filmmaker carefully set up her camera, capturing the moment for posterity. Local residents stopped by with old photographs and documents of their own, inspired to share their own pieces of history. "You've started something bigger than just a collection," the detective said to Robert as she prepared to leave. You've reminded people that history isn't just dates in a textbook. It's real stories about real people, and every story matters. Robert looked around his home, now buzzing with activity and purpose. The suspicious glances from neighbors had been replaced by proud smiles. The quiet rooms were filled with the excited murmur of discovery. His private passion had become a bridge between past and present, connecting people to their shared history in ways he never imagined. "You know what the best part is?" he said to Detective Chen as she headed for the door. "Every person who comes here leaves with a story to tell. And isn't that what preservation is really about? Making sure the stories live on." Outside, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the suburban street. More cars were pulling up, more people arriving to discover the historical treasure that had been hiding in plain sight. The house that had once been the subject of suspicious whispers was now a place of learning, discovery, and connection, all because of one morning's remarkable revelation. 1 month after the raid, Robert's home had transformed into something nobody could have predicted. The police department, eager to make amends for their mistaken assumptions, had become unexpected partners in protecting and promoting this historical treasure. Today, Officer Parker was leading a group of fellow officers through the house, not for investigation, but for education. And this, Robert said, carefully lifting a protected document, is a newspaper from 1865. Notice how the paper quality is different from what we use today. That's part of why preservation is so crucial. The officers leaned in, genuinely fascinated by the yellowed pages that still carried news from over 150 years ago. Detective Chen, who had become a regular presence in the house, stood in the doorway watching with a smile. She remembered the morning they'd burst through that door, weapons drawn, expecting to find stolen goods. Instead, they discovered something far more valuable, a window into the past that was changing their present. "The most remarkable thing happened yesterday," Robert told the group, carefully replacing the newspaper in its protective sleeve. "A local high school teacher brought her class here. One of the students recognized his great-grandfather in a photograph from 1945. The whole class spent an hour listening to him share family stories that had been passed down. We recorded everything for the archives." The house had been modified to better serve its new role. The university had helped install proper lighting and climate control throughout. The dining room where Robert had been drinking coffee during the raid was now a proper research space, with large tables and carefully controlled lighting. But he kept his favorite coffee mug, now something of a lucky charm, sitting on a special shelf. "The security system you recommended has been a game changer," Robert told Officer Parker, showing him the new monitoring equipment. "We've integrated it with the climate control sensors, so we can track both security and preservation conditions from one dashboard." Outside, a tour bus pulled up, the third one this week. The neighborhood had embraced its newfound fame, with local businesses even creating historically themed specials to attract visitors. Mrs. Chen from the Corner Cafe had renamed her daily special the Historian's Breakfast. "Remember when we thought all these visitors were suspicious?" Detective Chen laughed, watching as another group of excited history enthusiasts filed off the bus. "Now the whole neighborhood acts as unofficial security. Mrs. Thompson across the street keeps a logbook of everyone who comes and goes, not out of suspicion anymore, but pride." The police department had taken an official role in protecting the collection, incorporating regular patrols and creating a special response protocol for any security alerts from the house. But more than that, they'd become genuine supporters of its mission. Last week, Officer Parker shared with his colleagues, "My daughter's college professor mentioned this collection in their American history class. I got to raise my hand and say I was one of the officers who discovered it. Never thought I'd be part of a story that ended up in a college classroom." Robert led the group upstairs to his newest addition, a proper conservation lab funded by a historical society grant. "This is where we do the delicate work of preserving documents," he explained, showing them the specialized equipment. "That magnifying system there can spot damage that's invisible to the naked eye." The officers watched as a conservator demonstrated the painstaking process of stabilizing a fragile letter from the 1890s. The room fell silent except for the gentle hum of the climate control system and the soft brush of conservation tools. "It's like performing surgery," whispered one officer, watching as the conservator delicately repaired a torn edge. But instead of saving a life, you're saving history. Back downstairs, a group of university students had arrived to continue their cataloging project. They worked at the large tables, carefully photographing and documenting each piece in the collection. Their excited whispers filled the air as they discovered new details in century-old documents. "The digital database is already making a difference," Robert explained to the officers. "Last month, a researcher in London found information in one of our documents that helped solve a historical mystery they'd been working on for years. All because these pieces of history are now accessible to scholars worldwide." Detective Chen had moved to look at a new display case near the window. Inside was the search warrant from the raid, carefully preserved alongside photographs of the police officers who had first entered the house that morning. "You kept it," she said, surprised. Robert nodded. "It's part of the story now. How this collection went from being a suspicious secret to a community treasure. Sometimes the best chapters of history are the unexpected ones." The afternoon sun cast warm light through the UV-protected windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air. In the kitchen, Robert's coffee maker hummed to life. He still maintained his morning routine, though now he often made coffee for visitors too. "You've changed how we look at our job," Officer Parker told him, accepting a fresh cup of coffee. "We're trained to look for suspicious activity, but now we also look for the stories behind what we see. Every house might not have a historical collection, but every place has its own history worth understanding." As the day wound down and the last visitors left, Robert sat at his dining room table, the same spot where he'd been sitting during the raid. Detective Chen joined him, both of them watching the sunset through the window. "You know what amazes me most?" she said, sipping her coffee. "A month ago, this house was under surveillance because neighbors thought something was wrong. Now those same neighbors are the biggest supporters of what you're doing here." Robert smiled, remembering the tension of that morning and how completely things had changed. Sometimes it takes a dramatic moment to help people see what's been in front of them all along. These aren't just old books and papers, they're bridges to understanding who we are and where we came from. Outside, the streetlights began to come on, and somewhere in the distance, a car alarm chirped. But inside Robert's house, time seemed to move differently now. The past and present had found a way to coexist, each enriching the other in ways nobody could have predicted that early morning when police officers first knocked on his door. 6 months after the police raid that changed everything, Robert stood in front of a crowded auditorium at the Smithsonian Institution. The room was filled with historians, preservationists, and curious members of the public, all eager to hear the story that had made headlines across the country. "It started with my grandfather's book," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the space. "One book that taught me how a single preserved piece of history can open doors to understanding our past." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I never imagined that a misunderstanding would lead to all of this." In the front row, Detective Chen and Officer Parker sat proudly. They'd flown in specially for this event, representing their police department as Robert's collection received official recognition from one of the nation's most prestigious institutions. "What began in a suburban home has become something much bigger," the Smithsonian's director announced. "Today, we're launching the Johnson Historical Preservation Initiative, a nationwide program to identify and preserve important historical documents that might otherwise be lost to time." The screen behind them showed photographs of Robert's collection, now properly housed in a state-of-the-art facility that had been built onto his original home. The university had helped fund the expansion, creating a proper research center while allowing Robert to continue living in the house that had started it all. "Last week," Robert continued, "a high school student found a box of letters in her grandmother's attic. Instead of throwing them away, she brought them to us. Those letters turned out to be correspondence from a Civil War soldier that fills in crucial gaps in our historical record. That's what this initiative is about, teaching people to recognize the value in these pieces of our past." The scene shifted to the research center itself, where Robert's original dining room table now sat in a special exhibition space. The coffee cup from the morning of the raid was displayed nearby, along with photographs documenting the dramatic transformation from police operation to historical discovery. "We've digitized over 10,000 documents so far," Robert explained, showing slides of the preservation process. "Each one tells a story, and together they create a fuller picture of our shared history. But more importantly, they remind us that history isn't just about famous names and big events. It's about everyday people whose stories deserve to be remembered. In the audience, a young researcher raised her hand. How has the community changed since the discovery? Robert smiled, thinking of his neighbors who had once viewed his activities with suspicion. The whole neighborhood has become involved in preservation now. Children come by after school to learn about historical research. Senior citizens bring in their family photographs and documents to be archived. Even the local coffee shop has a display of historical photographs on its walls. Detective Chen stood up to share her perspective. As law enforcement officers, we're trained to look for suspicious activity. But this experience taught us that sometimes what looks suspicious is actually something extraordinary. Now our department has a cultural preservation unit that works with the community to identify and protect historical artifacts. The presentation continued with a virtual tour of the new facility. The climate-controlled rooms, the restoration laboratory, the research spaces, all designed to protect and share these precious pieces of history. But Robert had kept one room exactly as it was, his original study, where his grandfather's book still sat on its special shelf. "This room reminds me why we do this work," he explained, as the camera panned across the familiar space. "Every document we preserve is someone's story. Every photograph captures a moment that would otherwise be lost. Every letter gives us a glimpse into lives that helped shape our present." The Smithsonian's announcement included funding for similar initiatives across the country. Robert's collection had become a model for community-based historical preservation, showing how personal collections could become valuable public resources. But the most important part of this story, Robert concluded, isn't about the documents or the recognition. It's about how a community came together to protect and celebrate its history. It's about police officers becoming preservationists, neighbors becoming archivists, and everyday people recognizing the value of their own historical treasures. As the presentation ended, the audience rose in a standing ovation. Detective Chen wiped away a tear, remembering that tense morning 6 months ago. Who could have imagined that breaking down a door would lead to opening so many windows into the past? Back at home, Robert's house had become a bustling center of historical research and community engagement. School buses regularly pulled up outside, bringing excited students to learn about preservation. Researchers from around the world scheduled visits to study the collection. Local residents dropped by with their own historical documents, eager to add their stories to the growing archive. "You know what makes me happiest?" Robert told Detective Chen as they walked through the new research center. "Watching people connect with their own history. Last week, a visitor found a photograph of their great-grandmother in our archives. The woman was a teacher in 1918, and now her great-grandchild is a teacher too. That's the kind of connection that makes this work meaningful." The sun was setting over the suburban street, casting long shadows through the UV-protected windows. In the main research room, a group of students was carefully examining documents while their teacher explained the importance of historical preservation. In the restoration lab, experts were gently cleaning a newly discovered diary from the 1880s. Sometimes, Robert said, picking up his familiar coffee mug, the best chapters of history are the ones we almost miss. Every document here was once almost lost, every story almost forgotten. But because people cared enough to preserve them, these voices from the past will continue to speak to future generations. As night fell, the lights in the research center created a warm glow visible from the street. Inside, the quiet hum of climate control systems protected centuries of history, while outside, the neighborhood that had once been suspicious now stood as proud guardians of a national treasure. The legacy of that morning police raid had become something no one could have predicted. A reminder that sometimes the most remarkable discoveries come from the most unexpected moments.